All right. Unified Namespace for September 2024 Workshop Summary, Take 0. All right, in this video, I am going to go over all 3 days of the workshop, the UNS Workshop from September 2024. This video is really designed if you want to get a quick refresher on what we covered and what we covered on which days. That's what this video is for. If you want to show the workshop to somebody you work with, in addition to the public GitHub, you can show them this video, and it's going to give them in 20 to 30 minutes. You're going to go right through the entire workshop. The workshop itself was a little over 13 hours. Each day, important part of the workshop, understand that we were meant to be 3 4-hour sessions. Each day, we were going to have 3 elements of the training, of the workshop training. Number 1 would be foundational topics, definitions, strategies, the backstory of Unified Namespace, why you need this architecture as opposed to this one, definitions of namespaces, that kind of stuff, important concepts when it comes to digital transformation. That helps prime the brain for what it is we're trying to do, to understand why it is this is a superior architecture relative to other architectures that are available for digital transformation applications. The second component is a fellowship component where we try to engage with the audience, answer questions, just get people talking. We'll go down the rabbit hole sometimes in a workshop session. That is actually very, very important to get everyone to work together. And then the third part is the technical part. This summary is just literally a run through of all the technical elements. There's some new stuff in here. So I have a new diagram that no one saw in the first 3 days because I put it all together at the very end. And then I also have a dashboard I built in Looker Studio Pro. So I'll show you how we take that data that we got into Google Cloud and we actually use it in Looker Studio. Okay. All right. So with that, let's get into it. All right. So workshop summary. In fact, hold on. Let me move this over here. All right. So, all right. Workshop summary. The goals, for the workshop were, I'm going to review the goals. I'm going to go over the session 1 technical summary, session 2, session 3 technical summary. And then I'm going to show you some additional stuff that I put together. So workshop goals, I wanted to make sure that people walked away understanding why does Unified Namespace matter. So that's why we went over Holy Grail, how to succeed with digital transformation. That's all the keys and steps that we talked about. And then technology-driven architecture. I wanted to make sure everyone had an introduction to Unified Namespace. Everyone built a local Unified Namespace. Everyone integrated to a enterprise Unified Namespace, and everyone integrated their Unified Namespace to a cloud. You actually watched me do that. We talked about the reasons why I was the only one integrating to Google. Has to do with everyone would have to have their own Google project. You would have to have your own certification on your local machine. We will actually do that we're actually going to do that in the Advanced Unified Namespace Workshop in March of the Q1 of next year, in March of next year. We will figure out a way to get everyone set up before we get into the workshop. Important thing I want to talk about is trying to teach Unified Namespace in 12 to 13 hours is really, really, really hard. So you have to understand that what we built was designed. You have to fill in gaps to understand how this works at scale. I can show you what it looks like at scale, which we did in session 1, session 2, but there's no way to teach building at scale unless we do that iteratively over a series of workshops, and that is what we're going to do. All right. In session 1, we did an introduction and overview. We went over the manufacturing Holy Grail. Why is it that manufacturers care about any of this stuff? We talked about solution-centric versus product-centric approaches. That's the technology-driven approach to solving problems. We went over digital transformation principles. We did an introduction to Unified Namespace, and then I showed you an example Unified Namespace from an actual manufacturer. Then in our application, we built a local, unique Unified Namespace, and then we built a collaborative enterprise Unified Namespace. I'm going to go through all that code and everything we did here in a minute. In session 2, the second day, we did a review of what we did the day before. We went over the GitHub updates. There is a public GitHub repository that contains all the technical stuff you need to do this, everything but the ignition backup, to do all the lessons. Contains the README file with technical instructions. We went over that GitHub repository. Obviously, what's listed publicly on GitHub isn't necessarily going to be that valuable to somebody who didn't take the workshop. Obviously, if you didn't go through the workshop lesson, I think the public GitHub repository isn't going to be that valuable. But this video, in conjunction with that public repository, might actually do the trick. Then we went over our virtual factory architecture review, the actual virtual factory that we are building for the Prove It conference in February of 2025. What we did during this session was the beginning of building that virtual factory. Then we did our Press 103 review, and we talked about the history of that specific manufacturer that we based our solution on, and I walked you through that unified namespace. We actually walked you through the journey. We showed you how the data is wired together, how the UNS is built. Then we built our semantic hierarchy. This is the first time we worked in Ignition, was in session 2. We built our semantic hierarchy, and then we built our descriptive namespace. We designed it and we built it. Then we designed and built our first functional namespace, which was Edge. Then we built our functional namespace. We designed and built it, the OEE namespace. And then I went over data operations between the Edge and the data and the OEE namespace and the line namespace. And then we built our informative namespace at the very end, which was the dashboard. In session 3, we reviewed any questions, and there were a lot of them. I think I spent well over an hour just answering questions. We went over the GitHub updates. Then I explained namespace types, and that in definition is now those definitions for descriptive, functional, and informative namespaces are on the GitHub. Then I explained tag mapping. Why is it? I actually went through a drawing and explained why is it we need to map tags the way that we do. Tags are inside the platform. Topics are outside of the platform in the UNS. Then we went over a simulator. I wrote a simulator that would simulate the data from the namespaces we built in the previous day. I went over that. That's on the GitHub. Then we went over the Google Cloud integration, where I showed you how to build the BigQuery endpoints. We ran a script that basically published a JSON to those endpoints. I showed you how I built the table inside of Query using a JSON structure, creating records, and then I streamed the data into Google Cloud and showed you how that was done. And then we did a Q&A, and that was it. Okay? All right. So let's go over our architecture here real quick. All right, so I finally put together the complete architecture. The architecture is broken down into 3 sessions. So session 1 here is in basically column 1. Session 2 is in column 2. Session 3 is this whole big column here on the right. So let's go over column 1. In session 1, our primary goal was to build this unified namespace right here. Okay, so this is what your UNS should have looked like when you were done. UNS, your country, your city, or your country, your province or state, your city, your initials, and then your descriptive namespace, your functional namespace, and your informative namespace. And this is what that looked like. We wrote all that in Python. We have 2 files, requirements.txt, and we have the main.py. Essentially what this does is it generates our UNS. So I'm going to go ahead and just run the code. And then if you go to UNS and you go to USA and you go to Texas and you go to Dallas and you go to WDR2, my descriptive namespace looks like this. So it's got my username from my system. It's got the system name, which is Darwin. It's got the release of the operating system. It's got my host name, my local IP address, and my location. Okay. Then we built our functional namespace where we wanted to track our mouse. Okay. So we created a process called mouse tracking. Right now we are currently running, and we are storing our last mouse movement. So I have essentially a 5-second timer. As I continue to move my mouse, that time will change. If I don't move my mouse, you'll notice here in 5 seconds, we will not see an update. There's no update on the mouse movement. Once I move my mouse, we'll see that event take place in the broker. And then the last thing that we did, the third step of that lesson, and if you go to session 1 in GitHub and you see step 1, step 2, step 3, the third session was this informative namespace. And what we did here was we subscribed. Right now, I'm the only student who's publishing to the broker. But what we did have was we had 60, 70, 80 students all publishing in here. And what this informative namespace is doing was telling us how many students were connected to the UNS and how many of them had moved their mouse in the last 5 seconds. Okay. The idea of that first lesson, session 1, that's the end of session 1. The idea of session 1 was that what we wanted to do was we wanted to lay the groundwork for what unified namespace is. Okay, and part of that lesson was explaining single source of truth. Everything is treated as a node in an ecosystem. Everything produces and consumes into the same infrastructure. Okay, so that's part of what UNS's architecture is. So that's the end of session 1. All right, I'm going to go ahead and keep that running. In session 2, that's the first time we worked with Ignition. So in session 2, we spun up our ignition gateways. In session 1, we published to our unified namespace this namespace here. Okay. In session 2, we started working inside of Ignition, and we were building our actual virtual factory. So our namespace in Ignition was Enterprise, Your City. Then we were creating a production area called Press. This is our semantic hierarchy. We created an asset called Press 103, and then we built a series of descriptive, functional, and informative namespaces. And that all turned out to be here. So asset is the descriptive namespace with our ID, our in-service date, the model name for the asset, which is an F+ printer from the Comexi OEM, and the name of that asset is Press 103. Then what we did was we built an edge functional namespace that contained a shop floor functional namespace where we consume a job data set from an ERP system, and then we parse out the job ID and the work order from that result set in the shop floor functional namespace, which is a child of the edge namespace. We also had in-feed, out-feed, state, and waste, which ostensibly are coming from the equipment. They're coming from the machines themselves. The data is coming from the machines. Then what we did was we built a functional namespace called line, which had an OEE functional namespace inside of it. So we map in-feed, out-feed, state, and waste from the edge namespace into the in-feed, out-feed, state, and waste of the production line. And then the OEE engine consumes these events, calculates OEE, and publishes it back into the availability, quality, and performance. And then the OEE number is automatically calculated. And then the last thing that we did was we built a dashboard. A dashboard is an informative namespace, which means it is meant for a consumer. All the data there is meant to be designed to be consumed. It is the structure of how it's consumed. So we have the asset, the job, and the OEE namespaces, and this is actually what we want to send to BigQuery. Okay? All right, so what we did was, what's different about day 2 is that in day 2, this is our first introduction to Sparkplug. So we set up transmitters and engine inside of Ignition, and we transmitted our data into our MQTT broker, into Sparkplug, Enterprise, and DData, and we'll review that here right now. So if I go back here and I go to Sparkplug BV 1.0 and I go to Enterprise and I open up DData, you will see my location, Dallas 2, and we published to the Press 103 and the Press 104 endpoints. And the Press 103 endpoint is all the data underneath Press 103. Okay, so this is everything but our BigQuery endpoints. Okay, and that's what it looked like at the end of day 2. And then in day 3, well, one last thing I want to point out. Sparkplug B allowed us to turn our Ignition gateways into edge of network nodes. And our group, we chose to use the group of Enterprise, and then our edge node was whatever your city was, which was Dallas 2. All right, I'm going to quickly run through everything that we did up to that point. I've already showed you the Python script that is currently running. You can see my mouse moving, and we can still see that we're publishing up into the public broker, and that data is still up in our namespace. Any consumer that connects to it can consume it. We also have Sparkplug v1.0, and we have my Ignition node publishing in. That node is right here, okay? So we're looking at my Ignition instance. We have my Enterprise. We have my city, Dallas. We have our Press namespace. We're going to just pay attention to Press 103 because that was the one we built together. I created another Press 104. Okay, so Press 103, this is our descriptive namespace, our asset. This is our edge namespace. This is the stuff coming from the ERP system and from the asset itself. This is our production line. This is the ingress point so that we can calculate OEE, and this is where OEE is stored. And the Press 103 and Press 104 look the same. Everything we look at here is our is what we would refer to as red development. We'll talk about that later in the next workshop. And then the dashboard is what our consumers see. So we could build a visualization from this endpoint, and we also actually store that data in BigQuery. Okay. One thing real quick is, actually, let's go over day 3, and then I'll go over some of the code. All right. So on day 3, column number 3, what we decided to do was, now what we want to do is we want to build our BigQuery endpoints. We want to build the endpoints that we're using so that we can build a JSON. We publish it into a flat MQTT unified namespace, enterprise, Dallas, BigQuery, and then our endpoints. Okay. So this is our press endpoints. We're publishing to 103 and 104. Okay. The payloads inside those endpoints look something like this. Dashboard, it's a JSON, and then it contains all the data we need. What we do then is we created a schema and a table. We created a table. It looks like this over here. Let me bring this down a little. This is the table that we have running inside of BigQuery, and it contains, this table is a schema that is designed based on this endpoint, this JSON. So this JSON parses to that table right there. Okay, it is built inside Ignition. It is built in the IIoT platform, and then it is posted to our open infrastructure, into our broker. And then in this case, we're using Node-RED actually to consume it. We could have used Cirrus Links modules to do the streaming. We could have used HiByte. There's a whole host of ways we could have done this. I chose to do it in Node-RED for the workshop so that I could show each of the individual steps. I could show the consumption, the parsing, and the insertion. If I'm using a commercial product to do this, I can't really show you these 3 steps. They're going to be hidden like inside of a module. And so I wouldn't be able to show you the mechanics of those 3 steps and then the insertion into the table. All right. So let me show you how that looks now. All right. So now what we have is we have this now tag event, this tag. Inside of this now tag, it's just basically, it's an expression tag that is resolving to a now expression, which is basically meaning I want the value of this tag now to always be whatever the time is at this moment. So it changes every second. We have a script running on this tag that is doing 2 things. Every time the value changes, and it's on a 5-second scan class, so every 5 seconds the tag changes. By default, it changes every 1 second. I changed it to 5 seconds. So I did that in the tag group. But the first part of the code, from line 2 down to line 121, all we're doing is running the simulator, okay? And what that simulator is doing is every 5 seconds, it's running, and it is changing these values here. It's calculating, we're basically simulating poor quality, okay? And essentially what's happening, and we're simulating bad state. So there's a 98% chance. Right now, the state just changed to 0. There's only a 2% chance it's going to change to 0. Actually, it's 10%. There's a 2% chance that when we pass raw material into the piece of equipment, okay, that raw material is going to become waste. So we're trying to simulate a real world environment. The first part of the code is running this simulation. Because of the way everything is mapped, then what's happening is those same values are making their way into the OEE engine. And then the last part of that code is it simulates the OEE calculation. So every 5 seconds, the OEE calculation changes as well. All right. The second part of the code, so from line 128 or whatever it is, right? From line 122, 123 down, that is us going and collecting our data and posting our JSON to our BigQuery endpoint to be consumed by Google, okay? So now what's happening is every 5 seconds when this runs, the script runs, it goes and it collects data from the press and it publishes it to 2 endpoints, okay? So it publishes the press 103 endpoint and the press 104 endpoint, okay? Also, interestingly, I can do this. I can create a press 105. If I go into the asset and I just change my asset ID and I change the name of my press to press 105 and I create endpoint 105, this should work. It's all dynamic. So it should just all start writing individual values in. So now I've got a press 105, and I should actually start seeing the data inside of Google, which I'll show you right now. Okay. So now let's go ahead. What we're going to do is take a look at what's happening is Node-RED. So I'm using Node-RED. Node-RED is subscribing. Let's go ahead and add our third press in here. We'll go ahead and wire it in. Let's go ahead and deploy it. And what should happen is I should start seeing a 105 value. Yep, there's 3 of them. So press 105, 103, 104. And if I go to BigQuery, where we are all wired up, and I go ahead and just run this, this is what our table looks like. This is the actual table in BigQuery. And if I run down here, I should see press 105 being inserted in here somewhere. I do not see it. Interesting. Let's see if we can't fix that. Let's see why. Press 105. Interesting. It should be press 105. Let's take a look at our broker. Let's make sure we have a... So this is where our BigQuery endpoints are. We do have a press 105. All right, real quick, one quick addendum. Sorry, I wanted to show you that what I did wrong. I was doing that live, adding press 105 and showing the data live. I did it wrong. I forgot to refresh the data. So we're going to actually go ahead and add a press 106 so I can show you how this works. All right, so what we're going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and create a press 106. I'm going to go in here into my asset, and the only thing I have to change is the name of my press. And I'm going to change my asset ID. All right. And then I'm just going to build my press 105 or my press 106 endpoint. Okay. And then I'm going to go into Node-RED, and this is not dynamic. Normally this would be dynamic. Normally I wouldn't have to do this step right here, but because I wanted to show the students every step of the process, I actually am subscribing to the press topics individually. And then now if I come back to BigQuery and I wait a couple of seconds, I'll have some press 106 data in there. There's press 106. And if I go back to Looker Studio and I come here and I refresh my data, you'll see that there's a press. Let me move this down. There's press 106. So now if I look at the averages of the data, or I can look at the individual presses, but it's that seamless. That's what edge-driven, that's what report by exception, that's just one of the elements you get from UNS. You can create what is referred to as self-aware infrastructure, self-aware applications. The only step in here that I shouldn't have to do if I'm doing it correctly is I shouldn't have to create this press 106 wire. I shouldn't have to create this connection. This should all be dynamic, and normally it would be. In fact, I changed the code in the parser so that I wasn't doing a dynamic subscription. All right, with that, what I want to show you now is inside of Looker Studio Pro, I have a report that I've built. Okay, so what we've done is now what we have is a data that comes from BigQuery, and now we're looking at it in Looker Studio Pro. So first things first is I have 2 presses here. I have press 103 and I have press 104. Okay. Let me reset so this is what the report would look like. So I've just create a basic report where on the top I have the availability, the performance, and the quality that's being shown on the dashboard for both presses. So we're doing an average here. And this is the average OEE. So I'm going to go ahead and just drill down real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and look at the average OEE across both presses. And we're going to go ahead and drill down. Right now we're looking at This is down to the minute. Okay. So the average OEE by minute is being displayed on this chart, and the average OEE, the average availability, quality, and performance is being shown on this chart. This also gives me the ability to just select one of the presses. So now I can look at availability and quality performance from press 103, and I can look at OEE from press 103, and I can do the same thing for press 104. All right, so that is a way of how it is you do this dynamically. Okay, this is how you, I don't want to limit it 1,000. Let's put no limit on our data, and we'll order by timestamp ascending or descending. We'll go ahead and run this. And there's our press 105 data. Okay. If I come back here, what's interesting is this should, let me go back to edit. This should have the press 105 data in it. I don't know if it's because I'm not viewing. Let me refresh. This will eventually start showing the press 105 data in it. A couple of important things. We'll go over this later on in the advanced sessions. There was a bunch of questions about, why do I need a historian if I have cloud? By default, in order for me to get down to like minute analysis of my data, I have to create custom fields. So if you look at my timestamp, which contains hour, minute, and second and millisecond, by default, Google wants to analyze the data. Looker Studio wants to analyze the data by day. I have to create two custom fields, one that gives me the ability to view it by hour, and then another one that gives me the ability to view it by minute. I'm looking at time series data, but by default, Google just assumed I'd want to see it viewed across days, across weeks, across months, across years. That's the scope, that's the vision of cloud. But if I'm looking at it, if I want to see it at a higher granularity, I have to take it to a place that it wasn't, by default, it doesn't think you're going to want to go. Whereas a historian that you have on site assumes that you're going to want to look at data very granularly down, not just to the second, but down to the millisecond, because it assumes that you're going to want to analyze process data, like the changes in instrumentation. And that's just not something that cloud really thinks about all that often, okay? All right, so with that is our summary of the UNS Workshop. Everything that you will need, this video right here, all the documentation can be found on the public GitHub repository. This video, it will be at IIoT.university. What we did here, what I recommend that you do over the next couple of months is you take what we did and you expand on it. Okay, when we do the advanced MES workshop, what we are hoping is that we took the average fluency of a student who took the UNS workshop from a 1 or 2 out of 5 on UNS up to a 3 or a 4 fluency when it comes to UNS. We are going to go into the March workshop, the advanced workshop, and I'm going to do the lesson as if I am teaching engineers at Intellic Integration or Skellig or other engineering firms who have very high digital fluency when it comes to UNS. This first UNS workshop, it was the first step in that process. So if you plan on taking the advanced workshop in March, you should spend from now until then working on applying these concepts and strategies in actual production. Even if it means you have to simulate it, doing it the way that we're doing it right here, okay? All right, with that, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next workshop.